They say when you wear Black Power Media gear, you can accomplish anything. You can play any and every position. From coaching, to kicking, to receiving, to running and juking. And, oh my goodness, let's see that again in slow motion. Get off me. And you're going to have a lot of haters coming at you, but what you got to do is you got to shake them off, and get to your goal and accomplish it. And when that's done, it's a beautiful thing. I'm talking about going hard, extra, for that extra point. And when it's done beautifully, you talking about touchdown. Oh, and the crowd goes wild and they're celebrating with you and everything. Man, let's see that again. Nice.
Black Power Media, baby. That's how we do it.
Now go to blackpowermedia.org and get you some of that gear. Empower yourself today. Yeah.
I mix what I like. Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like right here on Black Power Media. Again, I'm Jared Ball, very happy to be your host. Welcome to everybody who's able to join me live, and to those who aren't, you just as welcome. So good to see you, good to be seen, and just wanted to do today a little bit of a response to those who've been asking really over years about how I develop my own approach to media literacy or critical media literacy or a media analysis, study of propaganda, et cetera, and so forth. And I thought we would go through at least a part one of some of what has helped me form my approach and what I would hope would inform some of yours if you haven't been made familiar with some of this work already. So let's get right to it. One of the first things that I wanted to do was, of course, the basics of, approaching some sort of definition. And to that end, I'm going to pull something up here to give us a sort of a starting point. It's not perfect, but just in terms of an approach to critical media literacy. Of course, media literacy is just simply the idea of understanding how to, or the approach to understanding how media works in society, how to perform sort of what I would consider sort of base interpretation or analysis or basic understanding of what media are, what constitutes media systems, maybe an introduction theoretically to some of what has been said, but just sort of the basics, some of the history of communication, that kind of, but critical media literacy is something very different. And even in its, where we'll start here, in its most ultimately conservative form, so to speak, in terms of a definition, pull this up here. Just borrowing from the UCLA approach. It's like a standard. Oh, it's not working. Oh, well, that sucks. It's not letting me move the, why isn't it doing that? It was just working a minute ago. It was all good just a week ago. All right, so let me figure that out, take that off of there. And we'll come back with another way of doing it. That's unfortunate. I was just messing with it. Okay, hold on. Let me try one more thing here. No. Yeah, I don't know what that's all about. So does that mean it's going to be the same thing with this one? No, this one works. So, okay. So I don't know what the difference is. So what I will just simply do is pull it up the old fashioned way, so to speak. And there we go. Defining critical media literacy. By the way, forgive me, just want to make sure we welcome some of the new members. I don't know if they were here from today or earlier at the Remix Morning Show, but welcome to all of you. More Holistic 602 ML and we out. But okay, so as they say here, the goal of critical media literacy is to engage with media through critically examining representation, systems, structures, ideologies, and power dynamics that shape and reproduce culture and society. It is an inquiry-based process for analyzing and creating media by interrogating the relationships between power and knowledge. Critical media literacy is a dialogical process for social and environmental justice that incorporates Paulo Freire's notion of praxis, reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it. And I highlighted dialogical process just as to point out that what they simply mean by that is it's a process of assessing both, at least my interpretation of it is it's an assessment of both, that is critical media literacy is an assessment of both the intent behind the message and the power relationship of the sender of the message and the ways in which those messages are interpreted by an audience and trying to understand the context in which that audience is created in determining how, or trying to understand how messages are interpreted or how they impact those targeted audiences. But just wrapping up here, this pedagogical project questions representations of class, gender, race, sexuality, and other forms of identity and challenges media messages that reproduce oppression and discrimination. It celebrates positive representations and beneficial aspects of media while challenging problems and negative consequences, recognizing media are never neutral. Critical media literacy is a transformative pedagogy for developing and empowering critical, caring, nurturing, and conscientious people, end quote. So the basics of this I agree with and find helpful. I would argue that you need more than that, and you need some of what we'll end up talking about here are the specifics of community context when it comes to the African descended people. As I've tried to argue elsewhere, there's, I think, a need, and we'll talk a little bit about that, maybe not in this one, but maybe in a part two based on what resources I pulled out for today. But there's a need, I think, for a variety of critical media literacy approaches. You could, you know, in other words, there could be obviously a Marxist-Leninist approach. There's you know, a variety of other approaches, but pertinent for my own and I think our purposes. I think there has to be understanding of colonialism and colonizing structures, and even importantly, or additionally, African-centered perspectives on the issue that challenge even Western notions of media, messaging, et cetera, and so forth. So anyway, there's a lot more even within critical media literacy in that sort of broad and relatively mainstream definition of the subset of media studies. So, by the way, I'm not going to check the chat until a little bit later, but so if you do have questions or comments, obviously don't wait on me, but if you would be prepared to bring them back up If you're here live, bring them back up later on. And if you're not here, obviously, we always encourage that if you're not here live, that is, we always encourage that your comments and criticisms and responses, just
put it in the comments.
All right. But what I thought I'd start with, and I actually put the link in the show description already, is a look at my own dissertation. Because a lot of times when I'm asked, about my thoughts on sources and resources, et cetera, and so forth, a lot of times I really just want to say, grab some of my work and look at the bibliography. And I know, it's not always interpreted, it's not always taken as it's meant to be given, but that is, how I generally feel. Like I think it would be helpful. So I did that. I found a copy of my dissertation online, recently put up there. The Mixtape, a case study in emancipatory journalism from 2005. Rest in peace to Dr. Catherine McAdams, who helped me greatly as the chair of my committee, in the late Dr. Ron Walters as well. Anyway, so we're not going to read the dissertation, but I'm bringing it up specifically just so we can get skip down to all the way down to the bibliography, which I was reminded in just looking today at how many interesting pieces are in here, and that I think are of great value still. So anyway, so I'm not going necessarily in order in terms of how I've created my own analytical approach, which would, of course, include a lot of the specifics of radical Black and African world history, and approaches to media in the context of struggle, and journalism in the context of struggle. The unofficially included, as we'll talk a little bit about, in media studies, or sort of tangential stuff, whether it's Marx or Fanon, or others who specifically dealt with the political context, because that's ultimately the part that drew me to even the mainstream version of critical media literacy, which is this, that it does want to bring in issues of race and class and power. So anyways, so some of these this Mark Ochbar film, based on Chomsky and Herman's Manufacturing Consent. Again, a basic structural basics, not so much. At this point, I find it to be basic, and I don't mean that to be demeaning, but I mean basic in the sense that it's not, I don't find it terribly deep what Herman and Chomsky did, in the sense, what I find deep about what they did is the willingness to perform the work, but the idea of performing a structural analysis, that is interpreting textually and otherwise the content of mainstream media, and then assessing it based on the interests of its ownership, and then within that the politics of the state, seems pretty simple, makes perfect sense. That their work was ever, or is still ever, considered to be controversial is more of the exposure of maybe the accuracy of their perspective. That is, why is what they're raising, it shouldn't be controversial. It makes perfect sense. So by the way, I'm probably going to rush through some of this too, because there's a lot I at least want to mention in this first episode in whatever time we have. So but anyway, I'm happy to always come back and do more and be constructively criticized in the approach. But anyway, I mean, I'm even reminded of work here that I'm not focused on for today that was really great. This article here, The Slumbering Volcano, American Slave Ship Revolts, and the Production of Rebellious Masculinity. I don't remember exactly what was said there, but I remember, enjoying, anyway, the subject matter. As I've said many times before, I always love seeing him on this platform. Milton Alamati's work from 2003, The Heart of Darkness, How White Writers Created the Racist Image of Africa. If you read that its specific focus on the New York Times, the paper of record, and how the ideas in the New York Times descend throughout the state's media apparatus. The book was fantastic, and you can see. I mean, it's so clear even how today so little is understood by so many about African history in contemporary African politics. Because whether they're pundits or academics or filmmakers, so much of what people think that they know about Africa has been constructed in the very way Alamati talks about in this book. So again, it's trying to understand the relationship of power to media production and journalism. What is the geopolitical purpose of the New York Times representing Africans in the way that they did? Similarly, Herbert Ausschel's The Agents of Power. Again, a very important book to me in terms of breaking down the sort of the standard approaches to understanding the history of journalism, to recognizing, for me at least, being introduced at the time I was reading it, to again, this idea that people are not producing journalism and media for the sake of producing news and media. They're doing it to support political projects, wars, expropriation, the production of a capitalist consciousness. All of the, so his point was that journalism and journalists are agents of power. They're not some neutral force just out here, doing its thing. Marimba Ani, not specific necessarily, again, sort of what in my mind, at least, outside of what would be considered official institutional, like she might be considered part of Africana studies, but why would she be important to a critical media literacy discussion? Well, there are cultural and worldview and perspectives imbued into media production. There is still this, if you even in terms of the context of her critique of Western academia, it's important to broaden our awareness and understanding of why media are produced in the way that they're produced. In this case, to protect a Eurocentrism, a Eurocentric perspective, a white supremacist imperialist view. I'll mention Herbert Aptheker here. I'm terribly troubled by the accusations of his daughter, and I don't know what the outcome was of all of that. I think they were made after his death, but I can't get that out of my head, and I bring it up every time I mention him at this point. And I hope I'm not wrong to do so, but I just can't help it. It crosses my mind. But the work was so important to me in terms of his documenting the history of Black people, and in this case in particular, because if you read these works here, a lot of the discussion in both of these, American Negro Slave Revolts and A Documentary History, a lot of the discussion is about the press and journalism. And in fact, his chapter, Machinery of Control, has a lot to do with the projection of a propaganda about the threats and dangers of enslavement or the lack thereof to protect the system itself. And even in his documentary series about Black history, there's a lot of it involves press and press reports, which leave a lot in terms of understanding critically the relationship of the press and media production to the maintenance of enslavement or other forms of Black oppression. Armstrong's A Trumpet to Arms, I thought, was a brilliant book about mostly white radical press history. The history of the underground press. It's fascinating stuff. Similar to what I've said about Marimba Ani, I think Molefe Asante's work was essential there. Ben Bagdikian's The New Media Monopoly. Chris Atten at the time, I remember, was writing a lot about alternative media, the potential for it. And I believe I've read him for his work on music industry. But Bagdikian, The New Media Monopoly, and coming from that industry, that mainstream press industry, writing about it, even from the perspective of a white mainstream male, I thought was and I always want look. The biggest and permanent shout out to Dr. Alice Bonner, who was on my dissertation committee, who I can't really say enough about how important she was to me then and today. Her work in the Black press, all that she had to survive in that, going into academia, and then I always praise her specifically for assigning me James Baldwin's Notes of a Native Son for my dissertation, for my comp exams. And I'll never forget, one of the best, came at that moment where, I'm still young enough and unencumbered enough to have the time and energy enough to do like I did that. I remember one day going to Adams Morgan in DC, and I sat down at a restaurant outdoors on a beautiful day, started early, and in one day, in one sitting, read that entire book and loved every minute of it. And especially because I did not realize initially why Dr. Bonner assigned that book. Why am I being assigned, James Baldwin, Harlem, like, what does this have to do with what we're doing here? That was, honestly, I kept that to myself, but that was my initial thought. What does this have to do with anything? And every page, it was like almost like a surreal, like, movie scene. Every page was like, oh, wow. Okay. Like, in other words, it's a critique of media. And I should reread it again. It was a brilliant way of bringing in all of the traditional theory and whatever that we had been going over in classes to see. And then, of course, later on, I would read, other work from Baldwin, which I should have included in this, or I should include in this at some point. What was it? What's the book? Man. Devil's in the title. I'm sure you in the chat already know what I'm saying. But it is, again, more media critique and media analysis of how race is used in media to maintain even material inequality. I mean, I just loved it. I loved it. So I always want to be reminded to thank her for that. Same thing, just in general. Like, I went back to my grad school work on it's titled Afrocentric Criticism, but what I was really doing in that essay was assessing the criticism of Afrocentricity. And a lot of them, the mainstream white ones, were just, poor. There are good criticisms to make, but the ones that we were looking at were poor. So anyway, Dr. Clark, just in general, has been an inspiration, and I never do it. I'm really bad on this, commemorating his birthday on the first of the year. But Baran and Sweezy, Monopoly Capital. I'm just trying to pick out the specifics here, so I'm going to skip some of this stuff. But I'd love to actually talk about all of these. I'm happily reminded of this stuff. Scandalize My Name, a great film about Paul Robeson and the red the red baiting, or the red listing of Black communists, or people deemed to be Black communists. Tate and Jones, I think, or I'm sorry, Tate, Jones, Barker, similar to some others will come through. I'll mention, I used a lot of their work for the development of my internal colonialism approach. My own particular version of the internal colonialism theory approach to understanding Black people in the United States, and which I think is important to understanding media and power as it relates specifically to Black people and other colonized communities. That issue of colonialism cannot be ignored. The late William Barlow, Black Music Radio During the Jazz Age, and his book Voiceover. He, years ago worked at WPFW in DC. Wrote a book that with dates as well that I use to understand the relationship of Black people, and Voiceover is great for understanding. Again, if you're reading, it's surface level the history of Black people involved with public radio, but what you end up ultimately getting is a better understanding of the relationship of power and media in particular. That is extremely important. Same thing with this Barsamian piece about public broadcasting, which I remember at the time using, because it was where I was interpreting it was why the white left and their public media world, in which I had been involved with WPFW, doesn't work for the work that we're doing here. And when you look at the decline of public broadcasting, the rise of even white left broadcasting, there's so many problems in terms of the hopes or the potential for Black or radical use of those spaces. Because remember, at the time, this dissertation, and the book I Mix What I Like that came out of it, the argument was for the theoretical approach to why I was saying we need a mixtape to be an alternative medium, and why spaces like even, YouTube and others can't do what we need them to do. So I used a lot of, the work of work like this to better understand why those spaces, which I think myself and many others have been confused at times. We had higher expectations for Pacifica Radio or Democracy Now or whomever, whatever else. And I think these histories were helpful into understanding why those spaces can't end up doing what we need them to do. All right, let me just move ahead a little bit here. This is a lot of great stuff. I don't mean to be disrespectful to any of these work, because I'm just seeing a lot of this stuff that I've loved for a lot of different reasons, but I don't, you can't take all the days in the world. But yeah, this one, Theobald and Barry, Radical Mass Media Criticism, A Cultural Genealogy, much like another book. In fact, I'll just do it now. I'll just show it now. So I don't forget to make this point. And you know what? It's not here. Why isn't it here? Oh, man. Ruthless Criticism. Where is it? I pulled it out. It should have. My bad. I'll come back. Anyway, my bad. The books like that and this other one, Ruthless Criticism, co-edited by Robert McChesney, whose work is essential, I think. But they left a lot of what I had drawn from them was, again, this criticism of where are the Black radicals? Where's the anti-colonialism in your critique of media? And the analyses of those you consider to be doing the ruthless criticism, the radical media criticism that you claim. A lot of them were left out. Anyway, obviously I write what I like. Steve Biko, I mean, he wasn't directly performing a media analysis, but the very fact of his work, I write what I like. The context, obviously, in which he was writing the work, the use of a pen name, Frank Talk, the obviously the subject matter, all speak to a critique of media power, the use of media by those in power, and played and still play an essential role in my own approach. Same thing with this Blumler book. Very interesting. The work is interesting, but the context being almost exclusively European and white, and often ignoring the specifics of colonialism and the thoughts from people writing against colonialism, or maybe writing about it differently. Left, I think was one of the reasons why I thought it was lacking in why we need to be, but also inspiring in the sense that I'm saying, like, they're saying a lot of interesting things, but not fully relevant enough for us. So anyway, and here, Oliver Boyd Barrett. That's why I had him on the show a couple of months ago when we were talking about war propaganda. I've been reading his work. His same thing. He doesn't, specifics are not African world issues and colonialism, but very important work in terms of understanding how the West sees its use of media. And his work on propaganda, I think, continues to be very important. My man Zbigniew Brzezinski, this was still one of my favorites. One of my favorites under the category of the ruling elite telling on themselves. But he says in this book that the fact that English is the language that dominates the internet gives the United States an imperial power and strength that, for instance, as he said, Rome could have never enjoyed under the height of the Roman Empire. That was one of the, so his point was, it's media and its imperial power that's going to keep the United States in power longer than other empires of the past. So I was like, yeah, that's dope. Thank you. My man, Dr. Todd Stephen Burrows, his dissertation, I think, is a classic on the role of Black media. And where he gets the title of his website, Drums in the Global Village. I would really encourage anyone who wants to understand, particularly the Black press in the United States, you should go get this dissertation and read it. Or we should tell him to still write that book. Write that as a book. James Carey. So a white guy who was raising interesting questions about the role of culture in media and the role of imperialism in media. And yet it caused controversy in our PhD classrooms to even bring his work in. I thought the work was fascinating, and again, coming from the perspective of radical anti-colonial, thought, I thought it was pretty basic. But again, he's not as welcomed and honored in those spaces as he should be, despite being a white man, in part because he was raising questions that I think he was not encouraged to raise. Let's see. Yeah, manufacturing consent, Chomsky and Herman. This should have said the COINTELPRO papers, which I think are very important. That's a typo in my own bibliography, because obviously when you read the COINTELPRO papers, it's a master class in critical media literacy, because you see the expressed will of the state in terms of how it intends to use media and the press. And it's not for anything other than dominance, suppression of dissent and radical, what is considered radical thought. Again, essential to understanding the relationship of power and the press and media in general. Same thing I would argue in terms of if you read the John Henry Clark edited anthology, William Styron's Nat Turner, 10 Black Writers Respond, which is what Paul Coates said to Todd Burrows and me was the model he wanted us to have our critique of Manning Marable's Malcolm X be based on. But that is, again, all of the essays in that book are raising questions about why, or the role journalism played in telling the story of Nat Turner, why William Styron's assessment of that early reporting turned into what he did with it, and why it was received nationally the way it was. Why was Styron, almost made into a hero in some circles? Because the narrative, the messaging that he was conveying in telling Nat Turner's story was wholly acceptable. His desire for a white woman and whatever else, all the other things that they were reducing him to. Alex Constantine in the Covert War Against Rock does a lot of the same thing in terms of the sort of the COINTELPRO approach to pop culture and manipulating artists into making sure that they don't do as I said you can't do, become rich, famous, and radical at the same time. Chris Welsing says ISIS Papers, again, I can't deny that being fascinated by her argument and her use of media to discuss to defend her argument. I credit Cruteau and Hoynes, The Business of Media, in helping me early understand the business of media. Harold Cruz, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. What happens, as he asked, when the cultural production of Black people becomes part of the national store, as he said. Let's see, move through a little bit here. Here's the Dates and Barlow book, Split Images, African Americans in Mass Media, early 90s. Where they argued, it was in that book, I remember they said, it's a battleground. Pop culture or images, popular images are a battleground, something like that. This was one of my favorites, by the way, John Downing's Radical Media, The Political Experience of Alternative Communication, where I actually learned for the first time about the mechanism of promoting the rebelliousness of the enslaved, of using the Black, again, so like something that I would love to see if these films ever wanted to be more real. It wasn't just a handful of Black people determining, particularly by the end of the 19th century or the middle of the 19th century. It wasn't a handful of Black people figuring out a handful of us escape. It was, how do we destroy this system of enslavement? How do we develop a rebellion so large that it destroys enslavement in this country and others? Denmark Vesey and others being in communication with Haitians and people in the Caribbean. How did those Black networks? Now you see a little bit in the Harriet film where she's using Black sailors to distribute messages and carry messages, but they don't focus on what that meant and how that was used by more than just Harriet in that sense, but by many others in developing or trying to develop massive rebellion. So shout out to John Downing for that. I always appreciate and will continue to appreciate his work. He wrote a number of pieces that I read in the early 2000s that were, I think, essential. Du Bois, a lot of his work, it's in Black Reconstruction, where he talks about the propaganda of history as it pertains to Black people. I've always found that essential. See, I actually read Michael Eric Dyson's work, and that's how I know why it's largely useless. This classic here, Entman and Rejecki, The Black Image and the White Mind, Media and Race in America. And I know this is about hip hop more than it is, but shout out to the late James Spady, man. His series were great. Anyway, for all of Fanon's stuff, Fanon, Sartre, all of the Memi, all of those, his early work, at least, all of that anti-colonial stuff, I think very, essential in creating the baseline for understanding that, again, messages are not developed outside of a context of a desire to conquer land and resources and to reduce people not just to consumers, as most Western mainstream media criticism is willing to say, but to alter the consciousness of entire people to see themselves as deserving the full array of colonization. Anyway, I don't, obviously I'm not doing it justice, but just really important, and has always caused me problems in terms of dealing with mainstream media scholars, hip hop scholars, et cetera, and so forth, economists, because there's always that layer of intention that they don't want to acknowledge, that the inequality, the oppression, this, that, and the third is real, blah, 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 is important, but is particularly nowadays sort of on self-driven. So there's no need to focus on the messaging and the propaganda that creates the self-driving, so to speak. There's no connection, they would argue. Yeah, this is something I was talking about Glenn Ford earlier today. This is some of his Black commentator work on the history of, why there's no Black local radio news. So, particularly at that time in the early 2000s, there was more, I felt that maybe I'm less aware of it, but there was more focus on media consolidation, corporate influence of media, so on. There was a look at, the absorption of local media, but Glenn seemed to be the only one, or one of the few, to focus on the impact that all this was having on local Black radio and the importance that local Black radio had to Black communities as being different from radio in its connection to other communities, so that when the particular impact on Black radio was not only a consolidation of ownership, but a specific removal of locally based Black reporting. So instead of getting local news produced by local Black reporters, local radio would be giving piped in national news coverage for some NBC, ABC affiliate outlet. Even in Black owned radio, even in Kathy Hughes's radio sphere. E. Franklin Frazier, obviously. Clifford Geertz, I thought, was important at the time as well. Nelson George. I actually liked his work on Death of Rhythm and Blues, even if I don't, Amy Goodman and her brother, The Exception to the Rulers. I again, one of the big reasons I'm so critical of Democracy Now! Is because I thought their work was so important once upon a time, and had maybe some naive hope for what they could be going into the future. But nope. Gurevich was on my thesis committee too. The late Michael Gurevich, was a big time media theorist out of Europe. Anyway. Dr. James Turner had us read this book, The Making of Whiteness, by Elizabeth Hale. And I thought that was important because, again, she talks in part about, birth of a nation and lynching postcards and media in the creation of this new white identity, this post-Reconstruction white identity that had to be newly invented to sustain the new America, the new white supremacist America. Fascinating book. Let's move ahead a little bit more here. Adorno and Horkheimer, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, the Frankfurt School of post-World War II, mostly Jews, writing from a Marxist framework, I thought did a lot of important work. Of course, Adorno had nothing good to say about jazz and Black people, but I think a general approach to the critique of the impact on culture was important. George Jackson should just always be read, just for everything, just in general. Sut Jali's work and the Media Education Foundation, a lot of great documentaries, particularly this one with Bell Hooks, I still think is of great value. Let's see, a few more here. I mean, there's a lot, The Dissident Press. Yes, that was one of my biggest critiques of even the white program I was in. Like the same thing, like you all don't even talk about your own radical presses. So I had to teach myself, I remember at the time, about the feminist press and the labor presses and the all of the dissident press, the alternative journalism that I think is still very important. And it would be good if some of these white YouTubers would revisit some of that history for some inspiration. Yeah, Jawanza Kunjufu. This is why I know he supports, at least unless he's changed, he historically, and even when I saw him speak at Morgan some years ago, the buying power mythology and some Black capitalist fantasy. Let's see if there's other specifics ones from here, and then I have a couple others. I mean, I'm critical of his work on Malcolm, but this book here I think was great. All of McChesney's work, I think is important to understand the media history, particularly of the United States. I should say the white media history of the United States, I think is very important, and his breakdown of the commercial environment, very important. I learned a lot. Marshall McLuhan, again, a Eurocentrist for sure. Not a revolutionary by any means, but someone that, and shout out to Baruch Gottlieb and crew, invited me to write an essay that's included in this book about McLuhan. I think McLuhan is fascinating. And I think, and I always thought, again, even particularly at the PhD level, I always found it fascinating at how little white academics wanted to talk about him. And it's like, okay, fine. You don't want to, I get it. You don't want to talk about Fanon. You don't want to talk about, George Jackson and all of that. I get it. Okay, fine. But in fact, Michael Gurevich, no disrespect, I said this to his face. I expressed my shock to his face, but he told me in front of other students that he was a media theorist teaching at the University of Maryland, at the time considered an elite journalism school, PhD level. said he had never read a word of Du Bois, and it was a sociologist. He was a sociologist. Never read a word of Du Bois and never heard of Frantz Fanon. I've always said that said everything to me. And I was like, you can't, I said to him then, you can't be serious. I don't remember exactly what else was said, but I'm almost sure that phrase is verbatim came out of my mouth. You can't be serious. You can't be serious. And what I was thinking internally, I know I didn't say this to him in his face, but was you shouldn't have a job. How could you be seen as qualified for this job? He was cool. He wasn't a bad dude, but I just like you're unqualified. And I did become arrogant in dealing with him. I have to admit after that, because I was like, you're not qualified to judge me. You're on my committee, but I did have that attitude. I have to admit that. Right or wrong, I did. But especially after that moment, I was like, you can't judge me and say that you've never read Du Bois and never heard of Fanon. Then you're not qualified to judge me. The context would be unknown to you. How does this going to work? But at least he didn't try to hold me up, so I'll give him credit on that. He was largely supportive, even if I mean, so I'm not mad at that. But I'm like, anyway. McChesney, very important. Albert Memmi, at least the first early work. Charles Mills, the late great, The Racial Contract. Again, so a lot of, I remember what gave me some problem in pursuing the dissertation, my PhD, and even in engaging the professional field, which I haven't done much, I have to admit, that is the professional communications studies or media studies. I haven't engaged because a lot of them, I felt, particularly at the time, they were too uniform in their approach. So Fanon, I used to quote him all the time. He had that line about he would leave disciplines to the botanists. In other words, he was like, I'm interdisciplinary. I don't have time to be wedded to one thing. So that's why I thought it was great that Dr. Bonner broke me out of my own developing shell by having me read James Baldwin for my comp exams. And this is why study is so much more important than reading. And I know it's not just the academic environment, the institutional environment, but somehow we have to recreate these structures extra institutionally. We cannot abandon study, organized study, as opposed to just reading. Anyway, yeah. So anyway, just get back on track. Charles Mills. I mean, Charles Mills. The Racial Contract would not have been something that they would have considered as part of a traditional approach to even, I think, critical media literacy. But again, I think it's essential to understand if philosophically at the grandest of levels, at the broadest ideological philosophical levels, there is an intent to defend colonization and white dominance and Black inferiority, how then does that play out when we read later on Walter Lippmann's work, which I don't think I have listed in here. Did I? Yes, I did. When you read in Walter Lippmann's work, him discussing stereotyping, and in one point specifically stereotyping Black people as a defense mechanism for whites, that's better understood, despite, I think, his good enough explanation. That's better understood when you understand that at the grandest of levels, philosophically, Europeans are taught to think this way. They are encouraged to think this way and to approach non-Europeans, i.e. the world's majority, in that way. The Power Elite, I still think, is a great book. I just heard somebody saying it's the first book in the United States to really hone in on a focus on that class of ruling elite. as a ruling elite. I don't know how accurate that is. That doesn't feel right, given it was 56, but maybe it was right. But I always liked his line. He said in that line, Mills did, what people think is common sense is usually more common than sense. I was like, that's bars. That's bars. Bars. Shout out to Diedrich Muhammad. I've been reading his work on Black economic inequality since early 2000s. As evidence there, receipts. Nkrumah, same thing, consciousism at the level of ideas. I remember ideology not being a big subject of discussion in my grad classes. And here's Nkrumah saying that's the thing. My man, I think this is better than these books here by Michael Parenti. Monstrous for me in understanding how media work and how they intersect with politics. And Dr. James Turner had us read this in grad school. So shout out to him for putting me onto that. And I was like, cool, because I was familiar with him already from this, but that was, very dope. Very, very dope. Oh, I cited Eric B. and Rakim. Come on now. It gets no more real than that. So I'm just playing. Walter Rodney, Everett Rogers. His work, not really. What I liked about this book was that it put Karl Marx as a founding father of communication study, and Karl Marx, and I know that bothered folks. Not necessarily in saying praising his analysis, but just acknowledging his importance to the study of communications in the United States. Edward Said's Orientalism along those same lines of Fanon. One of my favorites also is Herbert Schiller. I remember I definitely used his work to make the point to that because it was from him I learned how the expansion of Western Union and the telegraph was interlinked, because the company Western Union took over, or I forgot the details on that, but basically monopolized the use of the telegraph. But more importantly, as Schiller points out, that the telegraph's expansion across the country and its use in defense as not only for communication, but specifically to it was the telegraph and the mail carrier, the horse riding mail carrier. He talked about as being important communicative tools working in concert with the military conquest of indigenous people in the expansion West. So I remember finding it very valuable conceptually to learn from Schiller this idea that, so as he said, when you put a post office somewhere, it needs to have a communicative mechanism, the telegraph, and it needs to be protected militarily. So you're expanding not only the physical location of a post office and the, I guess, less than physical extension, as McLuhan would say, of consciousness through the telegraph, but you're expanding the military. It's all in service, rather, of a military function, even as people are focused on the telegraph and the newspaper and the post office. It's a military thing. Because, starting just initially, you can't have those savages whose land you're taking easily invading and killing your post office carriers and interrupting the mail and interrupting the delivery of messages through the wire. So you have to have guns go with the post office. I mean, and then you're using the narrative to support the guns, and then the guns support the expansion of the narrative. Yeah. but Black people should just start a small business and invest in crypto. Now, this is the one, this was always the one for me here. Like, this is my, I don't know, what is it, the Rosetta Stone, or my, and as I will always honor when, I don't know, maybe I'm feeling soft, but because she's no longer living and she was an older Black woman, I'll leave her name off of this. But at the time, I felt she betrayed me, snitched on me to the administrators at the university, had me removed from my job working for her, removed from my funding. She then later denied that she meant that to happen and didn't realize that they would cut my funding off when she basically fired me. And I just remember, like, well, but why you never, like, we never had like a performance review. You never sat me down and said what I was doing wasn't working. You never said there was never anything. I had no idea that you were this displeased with what I was supposed to be doing as a grad student, et cetera, and so forth. But because of all of that, my punishment was to spend the time I would have been working for her up in this grad student lounge. And they basically just said, go just be in there and just be in there. So I obviously just did my research and wrote and did my work in there. And it was in there one day where I noticed slated for the trash a stack of communication studies, communication studies, I think was the title of the journal. Now I can't remember the exact title. Communication theory, it's right there. Duh. A stack of communication theory journals slated for the trash, which I thought was perfect because we were constantly having issues in the classroom. One of the issues I had was the lack of theory, almost the entire focus on training people to work for the mainstream industry. And I was like, what is that? I thought we were in a PhD program. I don't want to work for the New York Times. And I remember telling my dissertation committee, they were like, why don't you write a version of this for an article for the New York Times? And I said, that's not my audience. The people I want to talk to aren't reading the New York Times. Man, I was so silly and naive. Had no idea what I was doing to my career at that time. But it's true. I was like, they're not reading that. But anyway, I noticed, I saw these journals, I started thumbing through them, and I found this article. And as you see here, titled Modernization, Marginalization, and Emancipation Toward a Normative Model of Journalism and National Development, where I was introduced to the concept of emancipatory journalism and totally changed my approach to everything. And it was great. It gave me the theoretical framework from a communication studies perspective, a mainstream, even if not well liked, communications studies. It gave me an anti-colonial framework, a so-called third world, a developing global South framework. It was dope. And then when I interviewed Shaw, got a better understanding of the work, and he agreed that my application of it to the mixtape was appropriate. I mean, it was just perfect. It was perfect. And I will always appreciate him for doing that work. And however, and what it did for my development analytically, it was this is it. This is the joint right here. It was just emancipatory journalism. It's fantastic. What else? Tab, a great source on the internal colonialism theory for Black people in the United States. There were a couple others in here that I skipped on that point. Greg Tate, Everything But the Burden. I think that book is so well done in so many different ways, a collection of different essays. I don't necessarily think we all agree. I definitely don't think I fully understand everything every one of them wrote. But the way it challenged me to think about how white people engage media, particularly media that involves Black people or the performance of Blackness, I was just like, this is bars all the way through. And when Tate, and it's in that book that I learned the word, I never knew the word panopticon. But Tate, in his essay, he's asking it in a question, if I remember correctly, like, what does it mean to be a Black prisoner, but to have a panopticon view of your own imprisonment? So I was like, what is a panopticon? It's basically an imprisoned structure that is designed to allow a jailer to surveil all of the inmates without himself or herself being seen. And I was like, what a perfect description of the colonial model of media, and it's or a colonial model of media. The colonizer is never seen, particularly in media that's defined as Black. And yet they can stay back unseen and surveil the entire process and everybody in it down to the most meticulous detail and manage that, manipulate that. So when Tate was asking, as I remember it, if I remember correctly, what does it mean to yourself be a prisoner with that panopticon view of your own imprisonment? Because he was asking it in the context of Black media consumers consuming white performance of Blackness. And he's like, what is happening there? It's like, wow. It's like, that's so dope. And I'm never going to forgive the folks I was working with that day. And I do blame them. We recorded this great discussion with Greg Tate. We get all the way back from New York and they said it didn't record. Or they lost the recording or whatever. I was like, oh my God. Let's see what else. Kwame Ture. Oh yeah, that speech is one of my favorite speeches. I think for now, for this, I think there's some other. This is Malefi Asante's early media work, some of his early media studies work. That I remember. I don't remember the details, but I remember really enjoying what I was learning there about the Black press on the continent of, or the press on the continent of Africa. Anyway, I'm sure Zen had some good stuff in there too. So for this topic as well, but that's at least. From that said, I got a couple more sources I'll go through at least quickly before we wrap up today on this part one. But that at least gets us through some of that. And again, if you have comments or questions, I'll come check them out in a minute. So please save them or repost them or whatever. All right, so I showed this book. Really, McLuhan is dope. I don't think I would have liked him. I don't think we were on the same political team, but his work I still think is because the idea, again, just the basics of, and I don't pretend to understand everything, but I really like his point about the digital media environment already, 30, 40, whatever years ago when he was writing was all more longer than that now, 50, 60 years ago. He was saying the developing digital media environment, that these technologies are extensions of senses. So his defenders will argue that people dismiss him as a technological determinist because he made everything, the medium is the message. But what he wasn't saying that because you're watching something on TV, that the TV itself is the message. What I think he was saying was that the very construction of a TV, the mass replication and distribution digitally of a projection of the senses of those who are doing the creation, the producing, leaves a lot for question, consideration, critique. So it's not that he was saying that the TV is everything. He's saying that the fact of a TV, it is particular. It has a particular way of disseminating a message and way an audience interprets a message. It's different from reading a book. It's different from listening to a radio. It's different from watching it on a big screen in the theater. Who knows how exactly he would break down a computer or a phone? Some speculation in here. But the point is, it's not the technology, as I understand it, not the technology, but it's the projection of the senses. So as he said, a pen is an extension or a hammer is an extension of the hand. The pedal in a car is an extension of the foot. So digitally, a TV in this environment is a projection of a consciousness. Anyway, so I mentioned this already. I write what I like from Biko. One of my favorites from Patricia Bradley, Slavery, Propaganda, and the American Revolution. Love this book. Love this book. Again, it's like for me, the way I remember it, the way I've used it is it's almost like a people's history of the American Revolution from the perspective of propaganda, how propaganda helped create the United States and what we think we know of the United States. And how much early the so-called founding fathers paid attention to propaganda. They were very keenly aware of messaging and narrative and how to manipulate people. Anyway, another one of my favorites, I think I mentioned Dan Schiller already, Theorizing Communication. Again, just important for oh wow, look at the page I just opened. Wow. Look into the page I just opened in a discussion of, in the chapter, The Opening Towards Culture. Wow, look at this. Neither Fanon nor Cabral would have had any difficulty at all assimilating Raymond Williams' insight explicated later that culture is ordinary in the sense of persons partaking of a common realm of vernacular, creativity, and experience. Yet for them, culture was perhaps more saliently extraordinary because the people's experience was only now in the process of being created and defined. To be precise, it was being actively created through an open-ended anti-colonial struggle. Shout out to Dan Schiller. Now, I had to come to his work not through my classes, and that's probably why. And Raymond Williams was another one. I mean, his work, I remember we did read his work, that Frankfurt School, if I remember correctly, and isn't he the one that I believe he committed suicide after or was he killed by the Nazis? Was he killed by the Nazis or did he commit suicide around that time? Something like that. But he had a very hard, heavy critique. And unfortunately, a lot of the people who are often accurate in their analysis are disturbed by their analysis, their conclusions. So I've talked about this separately in connection to the buying power mythology, actually. So I won't, I'm not going to belabor it, but just another shout out to Nkrumah's Handbook for Revolutionary Warfare, which again, not part of a mainstream critical media and media literacy analysis, maybe syllabus, but should certainly be there, or certainly would be there for me, and has helped me to better understand how media work or can be used. I mentioned George Jackson, and then I'll stop here for today with one of my favorites that I talk about all the time, the Cultural Cold War. Again, definitely not on sort of a standard course list, but Frances Stoner Saunders' work. I mean, her work there is, I think, it's one of those books that I'm a little bit jealous of in terms of how good I think it is, how thorough I think it is. And because it's in a topic area specifically that I think a lot of us don't focus on, that is the very white European world of cultural production and its connection to state intelligence and Cold War activity. I don't think enough of us pay attention to that. And I'll always thank John Potash for putting me onto that work. And I'm very happy that I've read it and will continue to review it probably forever. All right, so anyway, I just wanted to at least do a part one. We could do many more, and then there's obviously more research comes out, and I'll never be on top of the research like I was in the late 90s, early 2000s. I'm just going to be real. I'm probably never going to be that on top of contemporary research, but I do keep up with some and continue to read and learn. And I'm sure audience members will put me on to more. And we can start to update and add on and keep going, is maybe create a series out of this. And there's many more that I'd like to get to, books that are still, in areas of the house I can't reach anymore, but at least at the moment, that I'd like to bring out, and stuff. I didn't even pull up the Kindle on this one. Anyway, at least wanted to do, get started there, sharing some of what has helped me construct my own approach to critical media literacy. Anyway. All right. So are there any questions from those who are here live? And appreciate you. And if you have any questions or comments that you want me to see, please repopulate them. Otherwise, definitely make sure you are, all your bells and everything are clicked so you don't miss everything coming up. The remix is back tomorrow morning. Geechee, Diallo, and I are back on Friday morning as well. What is the standard that's used to identify these titles? We can't just think we like the information. How do we stop confirmation bias or decide when a counter is not worth giving time? Thank you for that. It's really, there's I think no perfect formula, and there's really there's no perfect formula for protecting that, but so one is I acknowledge, the way I do it is, at least I acknowledge where my biases are, and when I'm reading something that I don't like. And sometimes what I do like about the way I was introduced to a lot of these, at least some of these sources, is that I was introduced to them in the process of going through graduate school and being encouraged to them by faculty who are not radical and not revolutionary. So a lot of these sources that I mentioned today are not themselves, they're not providing the final analysis that we need. They are, I think, helping me lay the groundwork to reach the conclusions that I've reached. So, so even in what we've gone over today, I don't agree with a lot of them in terms of their conclusions politically. And so in that way, I kind of like that. And it makes that performs for me a sort of check and balance. I'm like, I don't think we agree, but you are introducing me or helping me to raise questions that I think are really important, and I'll put into a context and interpret differently elsewhere. But ultimately, I don't know. I think really the only way to do it is, in some cases, I have done this in with some of these texts over the years. You read them at face value. You try to understand their bias and their intent. I look at their sources, read their sources. Did they cite their sources accurately? Did they interpret their sources accurately? But at the end of the day, there is no foolproof way of doing it. At the end of the day, we have to make our interpretation, produce our analysis, and then it's offered up for critique. There are, every once in a while, somebody tells me, and I admit this, I would like if I've ever wanted to be more popular, it's because I would like more people to respond to what I've said, even if it's to be critical. I would like to engage more. So I like that when other more popular scholars have their work become part of a hotly debated community. I think that's one of the highest honors a scholar could attain, or anyone could attain, that if your work becomes the meal upon which people are dining and debating, and I think that'd be great, because that's really the only, there is no foolproof way. Yeah, I hope I answered that question. I don't know if that answers your question. But that's basically my own humble approach to it. Oh boy, I see. Yeah. I'll leave you to some of that. I have not read this, so let me make let me make a note of this. Do you want to say another word or two about it? Let me write this down here, because I don't think you're the first, or this isn't the first time you suggested this, or you're not the first. So I have an unfinished article that I wonder how much overlap there is. One of the many unfinished projects is I wanted to create an RMC, a radical media critical, an Africana media theory, or an Africana critical media theory is what I wanted to outline. And I was basing it on what's my man's work? Oh my God, what was it? What was his work? Thank you for the super chat. Appreciate you. What was my man's work? Oh man, I have to try to find that again. But it was the point was to try to identify what is his name? He was identifying the differences between people who happily and proudly talk about Black history, as opposed to those who happily and proudly talk about radicalism in Black history. And I wanted to do the same thing in terms of media theory, that there are those who are Black who perform media theory or critical theory. There are those who perform critical work about Black media production, but I wanted to identify what just happened? What just happened there? That was weird. Anyway, I don't know. Was I gone that whole time? How did that even happen? That's weird. Weird. Anyway, so I wonder if a Black media philosophy is what visually, not for a moment. Wow, that's weird. Towns demonstrates that humanity in media philosophy has implicitly referred to a social Darwinian understanding of the human as a Western white male capitalist figure. Oh, wow. Okay, right on. Mm-hmm. So that sounds slightly different for what I was trying to develop a theoretical approach, or a framework that focused specifically on the absenting. I think is what I was trying to do. I can't even remember how I was trying to do it. An absenting of Black radicalism. Like it's great to talk about Black people, Black people in history, Black people here, blah 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 blah. But not but not Africana Critical AC. I don't think I have it anymore. I don't even have it anymore. Anyway. So okay, we can wrap it there. I like I said, I appreciate you all coming through live. Those who will see this later, I appreciate you too. You know what? Let me do this part. You know, let me do one more thing real quick. There is one more thing I did want to do. Let me see. Let's see. Window. Let's grab the Kindle. And if I can do this real quick. Yeah, so let me pull this up and let's because there's some other good pieces in here that I would want to quickly at least mention as inspiration, and then we can do a full parts 2 and infinity going from there. But if we look at some of these here from the good old Kindle, although let me see, can I get this one here a little bit better? Let's see. Yeah, we should be able to do this better than that. Let's go. Let me at least do it like this. All right. Anyway, let's see. There were a couple of ones that I got to get to these Walter Rodney pieces. I'm definitely going to do one. I do want to, like, there's a couple outtakes from the second edition of the Buying Power book that I want to talk about that would involve us coming back to Halliday and Professor Nemhard. Surveillance Valley. This book got to be on the list. Like this is essential to understanding having a critical media literacy approach in the relationship of the military and intelligence to development of our current media environment. That would have to be on considered for sure. Propaganda and persuasion, sort of another mainstream approach to the study of propaganda in its sort of broad sense. But again, very important. I believe it's in that book that they talk about where I get the specifics of a critique of understanding entertainment as just entertainment, and where it's labeled as such specifically so people do not perform the kind of critical analysis that is necessary. Oliver Boyd Barrett's Media Imperialism. Again, and this book here I used in my class not long ago, The Origins of Mass Communication Research During the American Cold War. Again, I think I've talked about it here because a little bit at least, but the importance, again, we really don't understand the extent to which those in power have understood the importance of propaganda and how for a long time it was even more openly debated among white politicians and academics and business people, the extent to which propaganda should be overtly acknowledged and even welcomed by society. We got to have a deeper appreciation of that, particularly among people who we want to organize, and certainly those who end up in my classes. Edward Bernays' Propaganda, where he's just very clear where this place is run by an invisible government, as he said, that's going to give you all of your tastes and manage you, because we can't just have a legit democracy where people have free thought and can act on that thought. Their thoughts must be organized for them. I mean, a lot of this stuff is great, but I'm just talking about it. Oh, this was fascinating. The CIA Manual for Psychological Operations and Guerrilla Warfare. you know, uh, yeah, 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 yeah. Um, Fire next time. Oh, I even have a digital version of the Culture Code. This one too. I talk about it a lot lately. National Security Cinema and the creation of our TV and cinematic environment based on the need for military policing, U.S. dominance. Yes, sir. Uh, this one too. I mean, why is the FBI? Why would they? I mean, the FBI assessing Black authors not only for their political content, but to learn how to mimic them so that they could falsely reproduce their work. And send messages to Dr. King, theoretically written in a Black vernacular to encourage him to kill himself, having studied Black writing to learn how to do it. Same theme, at least for me. Media are nothing to be trifled with, and they're understood by those in power to be essential to maintaining power. You know, this classic here, I forgot about this, by Jerry Mander, 4 Arguments for the Elimination of Television. 70s, 1970s, talking about how the one thing I remember for sure is that he talked about how watching TV slows down your cognitive capability to make you more susceptible to messaging. But I definitely did not get that in grad school. I mean, Ida B. Wells's. I mean, you know, done properly, a study of her life and work is a you know, critical media literacy approach. Obviously, in terms of how she recognized the use and power of narrative and representation, and practiced journalism for those purposes in her own lifetime. You know. Let's see, man, rest in peace, Maroon. Wow, I got the digital version of this one too. Okay, good. George Jackson. I think, I mean, really all of these, but yeah, I think, you know. And then, yeah, if you ever want to know anything about, if you want to read a book not about my mother that has a lot to do with what I think my mother was like, Hetty Jones's book will get you there. But anyway, but that's neither here nor there. So anyway, I just wanted to show those real quick before I got out of here for this episode, and encourage your engagement with that work, and to let me know what you think for sure. So anyway, let's see. Okay. Oh, you know that work? You know that one? Yeah. I might have to check that out. We might have to that's funny. Might have to bring that up and look into that again. Yeah. Yeah. Bernays was no joke. How involved was Obama in the propaganda discussion? He allowed it as president, but did he signal that this would be his pet before his election? So I don't know. I don't have anything specifically off from. I can't remember Obama specifically, but there was this. I want to say in New York Magazine or the New Yorker. And if you ever see it, there was the article cover was a cover of like a New York City street with like you're in like in Times Square maybe, and with pictures of Obama all over the place. And the article was about the media strategy for his campaign. And the point of the article was, well, one of the points of the article was that I remember, have never forgotten, was that they were conscious to put Obama everywhere, to make sure his image and his voice was seen and heard everywhere, specifically so that opponents and critics could not keep up with the tsunami of persistent messaging. So that they said by the time you and Rahm Emanuel was the one who orchestrated this, developed this strategy. By the time you've heard him say something and developed your criticism and then shared your criticism, he's been all over the world saying 50 other things. So they were conscious of this, that just hearing him and seeing him, much like Theodore Adorno argued 100 years earlier, people will confuse like with recognition. So just seeing him and hearing him everywhere will convey to people that he is good, regardless of what he's saying or what he stands for. So again, I don't know. I don't remember. And even when I read I read 2 of his books, Obama's, that is, at least in significant chunks. And I don't remember him overtly saying this, but he has always been clear. And then when we did read, and you should go back and check when Paul Street and Dr. Burroughs and I did a discussion about his, the book, David Carroll's book on Obama. If you read that and accept that as a valid source, Obama and everyone around him have always been clear about messaging and propaganda being essential to success. How you present yourself, everything being manicured. What was the writer who was talking about how even the way he walked was adjusted so that his walk would convey more of a blackness than. And I remember, you know, early on when Tom Porter, Mr. Tom Porter, Godfather Porter, told me, he said, I was watching Obama shoot basketball on some video clip, and he said, or the person he was watching it with said to him, Obama's never been around black people. So I put those 2 points together just to say that I think Obama has always been clear that he has to, and his team has always been clear about presenting him in a way that will convey an authentic blackness, even as he, both experientially and in terms of content politically, is very white and conservative. So, and I definitely think we were all, subsumed beneath various levels of psychological warfare in terms of Obama's rise, and even now to people's reflections on his presidency. So, yeah. And again, the funder of the Real News Network specifically told the leadership, Jared is to be condemned for interviewing Paul Street. No more left of Bernie Sanders interviews. I'll never forget that shit, man. These folks are wild, buddy. I'd like to look at the positive deviance and why did this small number of radicals never drink Obama Kool-Aid? Has that been examined in depth? I would argue humbly that my little crew in the archives at imixwhatilike.org, some of which has made it to this channel, I think we did that. Daruba bin Wahad, Dr. Sean Utsi, Dr. Mark Bolden, myself, and a few others, under the auspices of Dr. Sean Utsi at Virginia Commonwealth University, organized what I think is the first public anti-Obama election panel that took place the next day. And we were the first in a room full of even some old black folks wearing Obama shirts to say, this ain't what it is. This was not a victory. In fact, quite the opposite. So I think between that start and a lot of what's at that website, I think, obviously we're not the only ones, but I think we examined a lot of, and then in the reposting that I know I did, because I was there and captured all the audio of that great Harlem debate, the first great Harlem debate on Obama, my little crew was heavily involved in capturing, assessing, producing work around where was this black left. Glenn Ford, obviously, Bruce Dixon, obviously, the late greats at Black Agenda Report, obviously, were the earliest in assessing and critiquing the black left and its complicity in accepting Obama. And as I shared to some dismay, that led to some mild little controversy later on with the dear brother. Like how you gonna replace me with the folks you said should be condemned for supporting the dude? But that's it. That's us. So we're out there. It's out there, but it was very difficult. It was a wildly difficult time. Thank you, Shaniqua. Appreciate you. Thank you for coming through. Always good to see you. So yeah, I mean, I remember, when Aikwe Arma, little old me, had to raise a hand and say, did you see what our dear brother wrote in that essay where Obama, he said, was perfectly situated to bring the African world into the new century, given his black and white ancestry? Really? That's where we are with it? We're magic mulattoing Obama now? Really? I was like, wow. But if you go back and look at that great Harlem debate or listen to it, it's on our channel here. The audio is also at mixwhatilike.org. I think folks have gotten away with it. I think folks have gotten off easy. There's a lot of horrible analyses all there for the record. Some of the giants of the Africana world, dead wrong, live on tape forever. And they've not been called to task on that for their bad analysis and what that means for their analysis going forward. I think Glenn Ford once said, any black person, any of these black pundits that come out in support for Obama should not be allowed back into the black radical collective. I was like, that's harsh. But I don't know if it's wrong. But at least their analysis should be critiqued today. Like you were telling us to support Obama. How can any analytical conclusion that how could any analysis you perform reach that conclusion? And if it does, how are we going to go back and reassess the path you walked to get there? Leonard Jeffries said, live on tape, Obama's election signaled the end of white supremacy and capitalism. It's on tape. It's on tape. Can that be criticized? Somebody, please. Anyway. All right, good people. I really appreciate you coming through. Those who see this later, again, thank you all very much. Definitely let me know what you think. And offer up some constructive criticism, some suggestions for next time. Definitely.
Put it in the comments.
Maybe you think
it's wrong, bro.
Maybe you didn't get
Message.
You know what I mean? So just drop me a
message.
So that we're never asked.
What is we doing?
Oh man. No, never. Thank you, Franny. Thanks, everybody. Need Daruba's comment. Okay. Oh, Daruba killed it at that joint. Daruba was at the Great Harlem Debate, and Daruba was not wrong. Right. He not that Hakeem. You got that right. You got that right. All right, good people. Like I said, thanks again. I hope you got something from this. I certainly did. I definitely appreciate it and love it, and look forward to the next one. And as always, we'll catch you next time, because as Fred Hampton used to say, peace. if you're willing to fight for it, and it's going to need a little bit of a fight. Anyway, catch you next time.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.